one of our panelists is speaking this morning, please feel free to leave it in the chat, and then we'll incorporate it into the Q&A portion of the conversation towards the end of the session. Third, if you're not actively speaking, as always, just ask you to stay on mute. And fourth and finally, would love for those who are joining us to just take a minute and introduce yourself in the chat function of the Zoom. Would love to hear who you are, where you're joining us from, and if you're so inclined, sort of what you're excited about to discuss and learn today. So with all of that taken care of, let's kick it off. So I am delighted to be joined by 4 wonderful panelists who are going to speak with us about the topic of shared equity leadership. I'm going to introduce each of the panelists and ask them an opening question, sort of one by one. So you'll meet our 4 panelists as we go here. So first, I'd like to introduce Jenee Gaynor, who is the Director of Shared Equity Housing at NeighborWorks America. Jenee, nice to see you. You look at shared equity housing initiatives and programs sort of across the country. Can you just start us with the basics? What is shared equity housing? Where did it come from, and how does it show up in communities around the country?
Sure. And I will do my best to answer this question briefly. We have an entire 90-minute webinar on this topic, and we run out of time on that. But so, hello, I'm really glad to be joining you all this morning. So for shared equity housing, it is a big, broad term, and it is sometimes a little bit of a misnomer, because a lot of times what you're asking folks to do is share the appreciation on their homes, not necessarily like their equity, that core investment that they've made themselves. But generally, shared equity housing means it's an opportunity for someone to access home ownership at a below market rate cost. And then in exchange for that below market rate buy-in, they're agreeing to sell it at a similar below market rate amount, right? So you're agreeing to kind of pay forward that benefit that you've gotten for affordable home ownership. And what it's doing is really creating a lasting community asset, allowing more and more people to access affordable home ownership. And we're going to talk about a whole variety of different kinds of shared equity. And so like I made some notes about the histories, right? Community land trusts are often one of the most commonly known forms of shared equity housing. And they have a real history. It was started, the model we have in the US was started by civil rights leaders in the South looking to create secure tenure for Black farmers, right? And the folks went abroad when they developed the model. They looked at all kinds of communal ownership structures, and came back and came up with this really amazing model that started rural. It's now in all different models like urban, suburban, rural. And the main goal of the community land trust is that you create an organization that takes ownership of land. And then instead of doing the highest and best use, like what we say kind of for zoning, they say, what does the community want or need? And then that community decides. And so often that is affordable housing or home ownership opportunities that create this real stabilizing long-term presence. We're also going to talk about co-ops, and I will leave some of this to the experts, but right, the long history, there's a really long history of co-ops across the world, but housing co-ops in the US, there's a real kind of starting point in the 1920s to 1940s. Often you think of multifamily buildings, and it's a lot about preservation, right? A group of tenants in a building who often are formerly renters take an opportunity to become owners. So they kind of often purchase that building and then create a co-op. And so then they become the owners. And so again, there's this community control element and this agreement that instead of a landlord kind of charging rents and making profit, the community is owning and deciding how to use their money, how much to charge, and things like that. And so again, often they create this lasting community asset where they agree to limit their equity in a co-op. Then besides that happening in multifamily buildings, we also see that happening a lot in manufactured housing communities in the last 15 years. And there's a really great and exciting movement again, where taking the control of the land and the community out of the hands of a private owner and bringing it to the people, like the residents are then governing themselves. And then the last kind of version of shared equity that I would speak about a little bit is a deed restriction that folks use. And so it's kind of similar to the structures that a community land trust use. It's a different legal agreement that you're using to preserve that ongoing affordability. And the deed restricted models have become more popular kind of in the early, I wrote down, I was like the early aughts. I forgot how we write the late 2000s. Is when it seems like it picked up a little bit of speed, often because municipalities were putting together inclusionary housing programs and they wanted to preserve these units that they were generating. They said, oh, instead of serving one family, we want to see how we can serve multiple families with this unit. And then again, it spread similarly, I think, across a lot of other nonprofits that were developing units. I've been doing this work for about 10 years prior to becoming at NeighborWorks. And I started out and it's folks in hot markets who are most interested in this. And now it's folks everywhere. They're saying, hey, we used to build an affordable unit and it just stayed affordable. Like it wasn't a big deal. We didn't see that huge jump in profit for that one family and then realized that it was unaffordable immediately. And so as people started to recognize that, they've been looking at these shared equity models, trying to leverage deed restrictions. And so there's a little bit less of the community ownership element of shared equity when you're using a deed restriction, but you are still identifying something as a community asset to an extent. Instead of serving one family one time, you're looking at how can we create an affordable unit. It's also place-based. So it's, again, very popular when you're looking at anti-displacement and like you're seeing gentrification as an issue. You're thinking, how can we make sure that we've got affordable housings all across the community? And so that's when deed restrictions tend to be most popular. So hopefully that feels like a good broad stroke to get started. Thank you all for having me. I'm really excited to hear from our place-based experts. It's one of my favorite things when I work across that broad scheme nationally. I hear a lot from communities everywhere. In the network of NeighborWorks organizations, we see more and more adopting these models. But now I'm excited to hear from you all.
We're excited too. Your excitement is infectious right now. Thank you, Jenee. Appreciate you kind of laying that broader groundwork, taking that national view. I think we could certainly probably have a 90-minute session about each of those different models that you discussed. So instead, or since we can't, what we have is a few folks, as you noted, who are from organizations here in New England who are working on executing different models in line with kind of that broader picture that you sent. So I next want to turn it to Aubrey Collins, who joins us as the Homeownership Program Coordinator for Church Community Housing Corporation in Newport, Rhode Island. Aubrey, thanks so much for joining us. We know that Church Community Housing manages a community land trust, one of the models that Jenee just mentioned. We'd love to hear a little bit about that community land trust. How does it work? What does it look like? Just kind of paint that bigger picture for us.
Absolutely. The current model we use has been around since 1994. I mean, we've been using it since 1994. We currently have over 100 homes on community land trust. With our community land trust, there are two major requirements. First, you have to fall within 80% area median income. Then second, you have to take our home buyers training course, which highlight the ground lease that we use, which is a 99-year lease. We typically get families in homes three ways, right? Sometimes we do a new construction. Sometimes we find a house in the community that we want to rehab and then sell it to them. But of late, the most common way has been the resale of homes in our community land trust. So families have been in the house for like 25 years, or they just want to move to a different area. They want to resell a house through our community land trust. So that's been the most common way. We do ask families to pay the taxes on the house and the land, so we'll be able to help more people. The average price of a house in Newport County is like, well, in Newport's like $635,000. So like this community land trust program that we run here has been tremendous help for the community.
Thank you so much. And we want to hear, we'll come back to you in a little bit, because I think we want to hear a little bit about some of the families that you're impacting and sort of what that really looks like. But thank you for that kind of initial overview of the community land trust. I next want to turn it to Nora Gosselin, another one of our fabulous panelists, who is the market development and acquisition specialist for New England resident-owned communities at the Cooperative Development Institute. Quite the title you've got there, Nora. Thank you so much for joining us. Can you tell us about resident-owned communities? That was, Jenee sort of briefly mentioned this as she was walking through some of the higher level points, but what does that mean? And how does the Cooperative Development Institute support or, facilitate resident-owned communities?
Thanks. I'm really going for length on the title. And I have a cold, so I kind of have a little bit of a lost voice here. So just a heads up. Thank you for having me. In a resident-owned community, so that's kind of the program that CDI, Cooperative Development Institute, works in. And in an investor-owned or privately owned manufactured housing community or mobile home park, the individual typically owns the home, and then a landlord will own the land underneath the home and all the infrastructure up to the point of connection with the home. And so for residents in those communities, you're facing the tough parts of being a homeowner and the tough parts of being a renter. And it can be very extractive because you can't necessarily up and move because your biggest asset, your home, is sitting there and they're not mobile. And so in a resident-owned community, it takes the private landlord out of the equation. And so residents will still own their homes, and then they do that individually, and collectively they own the land beneath their homes and all the common infrastructure, either through like a residents association or housing cooperative, depending on the state. And so they're limited equity, they operate not for profit, they're prohibited by their founding documents from profiting off of the resale of the community. And it ends basically the speculative sale and resale of the commercial property. And it pretty much functions like a small town. They elect a volunteer board of directors, they pass their budget every year, they make sure that their money doesn't go into like a landlord's pocket, and it stays in their systems, in their septics, and their roads, and their streetlights, and their community center. And then, sorry, there's an ambulance going by. And then CDI is a nonprofit that works in 5 New England states. So I live in Providence in Rhode Island, and I work in Maine to Connecticut, mostly in Massachusetts though. And our program basically helps groups go from the investor-owned communities to the co-ops. And my role is kind of the converting. So I'll get a call from residents or from sometimes community owners saying, we want to sell, or we want to buy our community. And then we go through the whole process from getting into a contract, getting due diligence done, accessing financing, and then ultimately buying their community and owning it as a resident-owned community.
Thank you so much. Appreciate the opportunity to kind of how you made some of the distinctions about how this program is similar or dissimilar from some of the other things that we've been speaking about. And I'm sure we'll have follow-up questions. But I want to move to our final panelist here. One Neighborhood Builders' own Belinda Philippe. Thank you for joining us, Belinda. Belinda is the Director of Operations and Community Building at One Neighborhood Builders. Belinda, we operate a community land trust, and we utilize deed restrictions at One Neighborhood Builders as a way to support folks for entering homeownership and achieve some of those other goals that Jenee was outlining. Can you just talk a little bit about what this looks like for our organization and kind of how, the history of how we've led those kinds of initiatives?
Absolutely. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us in this Fresh Friday. So I serve as the Director of Community Building and Operations for One Neighborhood Builders. But I also, when we're able in our portfolio, able to develop homes for sale, then I also serve as the licensed realtor this is what has positioned me to be able to have the opportunity to see this wonderful benefit transpire in the community and how we've applied the two models. So as Jenee mentioned, we use two different type of models. And the first, as Grace mentioned, was the land trust. This again is, well, we use land trust and the deed restrictions. And they have actually been significant, had a significant impact on 1MB's residents in Providence, and have also helped to serve some very valuable lessons. So with the community land trusts, these are nonprofit organizations like ourselves that acquire and hold land to ensure that it's used for affordable housing. It could be used also for things like community gardens and other community uses. But in the early 2000s, One Neighborhood Builders decided to use community land trusts to create permanent affordable housing with the intent of preserving it for future generations. The use allowed us to provide the affordable homeownership opportunities to low and moderate income residents in Providence. However, our hopes were a little idealistic, and that we thought that in addition to helping combat gentrification and displacement in the community, that it would also allow residents to build wealth through homeownership, and that they would then in turn seize the opportunity and organize around improvements and future use, and think more about community stewardship. It didn't quite go that way. One of the lessons that we learned, folks instead began to lose enthusiasm, begin to not really be able to pay the $25, very minimal fee that's applied for the use of the land, and didn't quite take action. So it became almost like a burden. And so we were able to realize this opportunity, that this was probably not the best option for Rhode Island. On top of all other kinds of complications with lenders not quite understanding the community land trust model and not having it as an option for funding to fund or finance homeownership. So instead, we gravitated more towards the model of deed restrictions. So with the deed restrictions, again, these are legal agreements that place restrictions on how a property can be used or sold. And One Neighborhood Builders has used them to ensure that the properties that we sell can be applied to low and moderate income buyers and remain affordable in perpetuity, even as property values, as we all know, rise, and the market, like lately, has been crazy, just very high. And so we seek funding to fund various, we seek funding through various sources and funders to supplement the cost of development. And this way we're able to in turn sell the homes affordable. So the funders then impose a deed restriction with income guidelines for about 15 to 30 years that require the homes to be sold only to buyers with certain income qualifications. And that's usually 80% to about 120% AMI. And in turn, these homes can then be sold affordable. This helps to provide long-term stability for low to moderate income families, and has helped to create a sense of community ownership within the neighborhoods. So 1MB's approach has been not just to stop at the 15 to 30 years restriction, but to extend it to about 99 years. And then this way, when we are able to secure more long-term benefits of the deed restrictions. But our best practice so far, and then we can elaborate a little bit more on that afterwards, our best practice so far has been an innovative approach to graduated deed restrictions. So in this model, we use private funding, and we're able to be flexible with the deed restriction that eventually phases out. So for example, if an individual is at about 100% AMI to purchase the property, within about 5 years, that amount graduates to who they can transfer it to or sell it to at 150%. And then in about 10 years, about 200%. So this encourages not only stability in the community, but it also encourages homeowners to realize equity. So as they stay longer, they have a greater ability to realize some equity and also create generational wealth, hopefully.
Thank you, Belinda. I appreciate you sharing also that kind of new model that 1NB, new model to us, I should say, that 1NB has been working to execute in the community. I want to go to Jenny for one more kind of nuts and bolts question, and then I want to turn back to our other panelists and ask some questions about the impact that this has been having in your communities and on specifically on the residents of homes that are part of these kind of shared equity programs. Jenny, my nuts and bolts question is, Belinda touched on some of the challenges that might arise in any of these initiatives. When you look across the country and you see shared equity models being deployed towards this, grand goal of supporting folks in entering into home ownership, what are some of the biggest challenges that you see? And take that however you want, facing organizations, facing people, facing communities. Just what are some of the things that you think are challenges?
Yeah. I think that I like picking up on things that folks have mentioned so far. I think one of the challenges can be meeting residents where they are, right? Like there are some places and communities where that like traditional community land trust model or like that deep cooperative engagement is the right fit, and it's what the residents want and it's what they are interested in engaging in. And there are some circumstances where that is just one more thing on a long list of someone's things to do, and like that isn't the kind of engagement they want. That's not where they're finding community. Like they might have their community needs met elsewhere, right? And so I think it is being responsive to what the residents want. And so, right, like it's like you might have this vision of that deeply engaged community land trust, but then when you find out who you're serving and who you're working with, you find out what they actually want. And so that kind of pivot that Belinda described, like, I think it's just important to acknowledge. It's always important to have, for me, it's always important to have some form of like resident engagement and leadership, but like acknowledging that it should be based on what the residents want and what they're asking you for, compared to kind of imposing this like idealistic vision that isn't what they want, right? So I think that can be a challenge, and like not everyone makes that pivot, and that pivot can take a while, like figuring it all out, and it might change over time too. So that is one challenge. And the other one, I think Belinda also touched on it a little bit, like that funding and financing work. There's been a lot of work done nationally to make mortgage access like better. And there are systems and programs, like most of these mortgages can be sold on the secondary market if you like get things lined up correctly. But right, it took some work to get there. And then folks face the same development costs and subsidy needs for that first subsidy as like everyone building houses. And like right now, it is expensive and it is hard to make that happen. And so like Aubrey was saying, like that is one of the benefits of this model, right? You don't always have to build a new home. You've got resales and you can be selling these homes to like serve more people without having to do all of that development. So those are kind of the two big trends. And again, I'd love to hear folks talk about what that's looking like for them in their work. Okay, thanks. I'm going to drop into a national like study that we just did about some of our work and some more examples across the country, just in case folks are interested.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that's great. Would love to see that link dropped in the chat. Aubrey, I'm going to come back to you. Would be interested if you could talk a little bit about, you painted a little bit of a picture for us about the high housing costs in Newport. think probably most folks on this call can understand and imagine the serious challenge as it relates to maintaining housing affordabilities, particularly in communities like Newport. Can you talk about some of the successes that you've seen, and in particular, if there are people or communities who are at the center of those successes, just to help folks really see what it looks like to have this work turn out in the way that we all hope it would?
Yeah, in fact, we're currently building 2 new homes in Middletown, which is 1 town over from Newport. So the average price of a house in that community is, in that locale, is over roughly 600,000 as well. So, but right now we're able to put 2 families into a home for like $230,000, which is incredible. So like, the thing about Newport County, there's not much of a middle class, and I used to live here 20 years ago, and it's a lot less now than it was 20 years ago. Gentrification is a real thing here, where people of low or moderate income are really being pushed out. So like, one of the things I love about our organization and this community land trust is that we're able to keep residents here, people that been renting or they grew up here, through our program, they're able to buy here. And in fact, one of the potential homeowners should be like 3 or 4 generations here. So otherwise you will have to live off this all.
That's incredible. Congratulations
Thank
to you and to the homeowners, right? Thank you for sharing that. Nora, I want to turn it to you, and a similar question. Can you just paint us a picture? It can get so complicated. We're in the weeds of these deed restrictions and these legal agreements and stuff. Can you just share with us the success and example of the way that the resident-owned communities work you lead has impacted folks?
Success. One that comes to mind is last year in Wareham. There are towns that have a lot of manufactured housing communities, often because it's like workforce, or just like they date back to campgrounds sometimes. And Wareham has like 13 manufactured housing communities in it out towards the Cape. And, I'd worked there with 4 groups who weren't able to become resident owned since 2020. And they were all being purchased by this one large private equity real estate investment trust company. That's one of the challenges facing it, that those companies are just barreling into this sector and driving up prices to things that like would never be heard of, 10 years ago. And so these 4 communities, they were like going through the process to become resident owned. And for a number of reasons, it didn't work out. And this large company bought. And this 5th community, basically they went up for sale, and it'd been a long time family owner. Sale price was $12.1 million. And this group, like from March of last year through the summer, just met every week in this church, and like, just like, we're just so like clear-eyed about like, we are going to do this. Like, we are not messing around here. They had this board volunteer group that were just like knocking on every one of the 150 doors and just like taking the time with every resident. It was a retirement 55 and over community, to be like, this is why we are going to do it. This is our plan. This is what it's going to look like. This is what it means for you. So it was super just driven by this group. And then we had this vote at this like billiards hall, because there are always the votes in the funkiest places. And we had folks who were like 97 years old come out to cast a vote. We had folks who had lived there for 40 years and whose parents had lived there, and they decided to become resident owned, and they had this great party. So a success would look like the fact that there was a lot of communities that weren't able to get to that point, really because of these sale prices, through no fault of the group. Just, it's not a right of first refusal or an opportunity to buy if it's too expensive to really exercise it. And then this last group was like just, and we also had, I would stress, like the state of Massachusetts also invested for the first time in that community. So that made a big difference too. And really contextualizing why this is affordable housing that needs state attention and support was a big win for the resident ownership movement here in New England.
That's incredible. Thank you for sharing that. Just like over here grinning, thinking about how powerful just that vision of folks knocking on every one of the 150 doors and meeting in the church basement. I'm going to ask Belinda the same question, but as she comes off mute, after that, I'm going to open it up to folks who are on the Zoom here to ask questions. So make sure you're taking your notes and jotting down what you're hoping to ask. Belinda, can you share a success that we've seen at One Neighborhood Builders with our models in shared equity housing?
Sure. So in the last 3 years, we've been able to develop 9 different units of home ownership property and using 2 unique development models. So I've had the pleasure of seeing families be able to secure and purchase homes in these 2 developments. One, which was the Sheraton Small Homes. It was more of like a 5 small homes within a condo style setup. And for those who are not aware, these Fresh Fridays are recorded. So we've already featured the small homes, and you can get more information on that there. And then another one was 4 units of what we would call the Manton Ave live work properties. And so this was also a very unique setup. It included a 2-bedroom unit of owner occupied, and then a 1-bedroom of, and the individuals who purchased those had to be within 120% or less of annual median income. And then there was a 1-bedroom unit that individuals had to qualify to rent, and that would be like 90. It was a 1-bedroom, and they had to qualify by being within 60% AMI. And so this would help the homeowner to generate some rental income. And then finally, the live work aspect of it was a small commercial space that you could either choose to work out of or generate income by renting at an unrestricted, so they could generate like market value. Now, all 9 of those units were successfully purchased, and we're still in touch with those individuals, providing supports as needed. But one of the ones that stand out the most in my mind is one other model that we used. We were able to secure, as I mentioned to you, the graduated deed restriction. We were able to secure about maybe 3 years ago private funding from Rhode Island Foundation to purchase and rehab, as Aubrey was mentioning, to rehab some properties. And so they were called P3, and the P3 meaning preserving Providence properties. And these were tenants of ours with the intention of preparing them for home ownership. Of course, COVID hit, and that made it really difficult, and folks got set back. But gratefully, one family that was low income they were able to secure, because their children became adults at that point and contributed to the family income, and they were able to reach 100% AMI last year in 2022, and they were able to purchase one of the properties. So we've had that success there, and they're the ones that took advantage of the graduated income. They were thinking of leaving Rhode Island, but with this opportunity, they realized that their mortgage plus the rental income allow them to be able to stay a little longer. And the longer they stay, the more incentive they have to be able to then resell that property or transfer that ownership and generate some equity and some generational income, generational wealth rather. So that's the one that I think our hearts got the warmest out of, because it wasn't strictly home ownership, but it was, wow, a tenant became a homeowner, was able to stay in Rhode Island, was able to have the success and pride of home ownership, and can generate some equity hopefully someday. So that's the last one.
Thank you so much, Belinda.
Welcome.
Thanks for sharing those examples. I see one question in the chat, which I'm going to paraphrase here, but please, other feel free to either just come off mute after with this initial question or to drop your question in the chat. So Rory is asking about how the organizations who are represented here support individuals once they are living in individuals and families once they are living in these homes, or if they are, you know, existing homeowners in the case of the resident-owned communities. Are there ways that you partner with other organizations around transportation or employment supports or other things like that? So if anyone has an example or some response or context they want to provide to that question, please feel free to share.
I can kick us off. I think this is something that CDI is trying to explore more. And I think it's something that often comes down to like a volunteer board of directors in each unique, you know, specific resident-owned community. So they're often the support services that homeowners in ROCs are connected to as often very case by case based on what the town is. Off the bat, a lot of times it's councils on aging and you know, local community centers, local food banks, stuff like that. And I've seen board of directors in resident-owned communities really set the precedent. Like every Friday, you know, we're having a food bank at our community center. So it is more like resident driven than driven by our CDI as a nonprofit. And I think there's benefits to that. I think sometimes it's a lot to ask of a volunteer board of directors, which can be often true in a housing cooperative. It's a lot to ask of people, often uncompensated, but I would say it's case by case. And I think there's better work to be done in our ROCs around like transportation access and stuff like that. And COVID was a big learning curve with tech access, I would say, because all of a sudden, all these meetings or all these like app conversions were happening electronically, and there'd be communities where there's no internet or people don't have computers. So we really had to kind of like go both feet in and figure that out. And I think I learned a lot from that process in terms of access.
Thank you.
I also want to note that I'm a HUD certified counselor, and also I teach the classes in regards to the homeownership. So as students go through the program, I stress during the course that we're always available as a resource. So if they find themselves in financial trouble while they're facing foreclosure, or they think about repairs to the roof or whatever, I stress during the course that I'm able to help them connect with the proper resources. So, and of course, we're connected with various nonprofits throughout the community. So, but that's one of the ways we do it.
Thanks so much.
I'll add also that individuals get so focused on home ownership, and you forget that you're still going to have challenges regardless, and so one of the things that we were able to identify was one of the homeowners was so laser focused about becoming a homeowner, and that was great, and we got her in, it was such a success, and then she continued to struggle financially, obviously. And so we said, you know what, we can help you find, because they're left on their own to now find and secure a tenant as part of the requirements with the deed restriction and all. And so we were able to help find actually most of them, the tenants, and help them qualify those individuals. We stay involved with qualifying the income for the tenants. And then one had secured a tenant on their own, came back and said, oh no, it was a disaster. The person, didn't stay. They ruined the unit. This is only 1 year old, and they were very devastated. And so what we were able to do is connect them to some resources locally with Amos House that allows for like $3,000 to take on somebody who was previously homeless. And so she was able to get those funds, make the repairs, take on this tenant, who then also had a housing voucher. And so that kind of just gave her some cushion of security for like a year or two, plus with a new tenant, and having checked back in with her, it's going successfully. So not everything is gonna go rosy, But knowing that we have certain resources, or we can connect them to certain resources and still continue to understand that you're still gonna go through challenges financially. This is just maybe a pride of home ownership and different economic investment, but still a heavy investment. So we do stay very much involved, and that was one of the recent success stories.
Thank you, Belinda. I wanted to ask Jenee, kind of as we're nearing our close here, if you could talk a little bit about what you see as the future of shared equity housing models. There are new things coming down the pike. Is there sort of emerging learning? We could probably all read the report that you shared. So maybe there's a few points in that you'd like to highlight.
No, thank you. I think it's so hard. Because I think, as like you all have reflected, things are really community by community based. And I think that responsiveness is like one of the areas of the future. I do think that there is opportunity for increased access to like mortgages, which has been a really big challenge. And so I think that there's like a lot of opportunity there. It's related to Fannie and Freddie and duty to serve and all of these things, but I think there's a lot of opportunity there. We've seen some more standardization in terms of like not all of the elements of a deed restriction, but the ones that lenders care about the most. And I think that provides a really big opportunity, because the more mortgage lenders see this as not a niche area, the more services there are going to be. And the more I think there's a lot of opportunity there. I think that there's also just opportunity in the like opportunity to purchase kinds of things that that relate to the rocks and multifamily buildings, but also just like that kind of community organizing element. And I see opportunity between like that kind of resident organizing and nonprofits with existing capacity. And so I think that is a place to like build connections and try to like get these programs going with that community ownership and community driven element. So I think those are a couple of things, but definitely check out the report and I'll toss it back.
Thank you, Jenee. And we're right at 9:30. So the last thing I just want to say as we're closing here is if folks on this call want to learn more about shared equity housing or about the work of each of your organizations, how might they get in touch with you? And if they may email you or call you, if you as the panelists here don't mind sharing your information in the chat, and I know we probably won't be able to get to all of the questions. So if there's any initial comments to that, please feel free to share them, panelists. All set?
I just simply put my contact in the chat, and you can feel free to reach out if it's information that I don't have direct information with, or resources about somebody in-house within the organization can help. And again, thank you for joining us today.
Wonderful. Thank you all. I want to take time to just thank all of our panelists for spending time with us and sharing your expertise in the programs and initiatives you're learning in your community. And thanks to everyone else for taking a little bit of time out of your Friday morning. We have another session coming up on April 14th, which more information will be coming out about that. If you've attended this, you'll get our emails next time. And looking forward to seeing you at a future Fresh Friday. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.